Before we get started, just a quick word from World Extreme Medicine. If you work in pre-hospital, remote, expedition, humanitarian or high-risk environments, World Extreme Medicine exists for one reason: to help you deliver safe, effective care where resources are limited, decisions matter, and help is a long way off. From expedition and wilderness medicine to hostile environments, dive medicine, leadership, and human performance under pressure, World Extreme Medicine bring together clinicians and operators with real-world experience in some of the most challenging settings on the planet. Their courses, webinars, and global faculty are built around practical decision-making, not just theory, to focus really on what actually works when things go wrong, far from definitive care. To find out more and explore upcoming courses and indeed educational content, visit worldextrememedicine.com or head to the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm joined by Paige Mason. She has a Master of Arts, but she's also a researcher, paramedic, and educator who has reframed the way we think about well-being on the front line of paramedicine. So in this episode, we're going to actually unpack Paige's work for her master's thesis, actually, what it means for individual paramedics, teams, and services striving to build resilient, healthy, and sustainable careers in pre-hospital care. So Paige is a primary care paramedic who's just gone on and done her advanced care paramedic qualification with Ottawa Paramedic Service. She's also a member of the McNally Project for Paramedicine Research, where she advocates for paramedic-driven inquiry. So she holds a Bachelor of Arts in Health Science from Western University and completed a Master of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies at Royal Roads University, graduating with a distinction for her thesis and indeed the topic of the conversation today around paramedic flourishing at work, a way forward. So her research and indeed the questions today really are going to explore how we enable paramedics to thrive in what is one of the most demanding health professions across the spectrum, shifting the focus away from reducing burnout to understanding and fostering workplace flourishing. Welcome to the podcast, Paige.
Thank you so much for having me. That was quite an intro.
Paige, I just wondered, as a framer, could I get you to speak to just a summary, really, of your research for listeners?
Absolutely, yeah. It was actually during the pandemic. I was doing my master's and looking for a thesis topic. And I found myself kind of, even in the face of the pandemic, still feeling a lot of joy and meaning from my work. And I felt like I was surrounded by a group of people who sort of felt the same and had a very positive outlook. I mean, we could vent, but just overall still getting a lot of meaning and joy from our work. And I was curious what it was that was different, that made us feel such meaning. So I started to look at Flourishing, which is on the mental health continuum by Corey Keyes. And it's a continuum from flourishing to languishing. Basically, flourishing is it's hedonic and eudaimonic forms of well-being. So it's not just happiness. It's both feeling positive emotions, but also functioning well and feeling that meaning and purpose that's really important for us. So I wanted to look at first, within my own workplace, is anyone flourishing? To get a better understanding of it, I needed to know if anyone was, which is kind of a risky question to ask in the middle of a global pandemic. But from there, I used purposeful sampling and kind of a salutogenic approach. So because I was using a strength-based design, I'm interested in knowing more about who's flourishing and why and what can their stories tell us. I specifically sampled from the flourishing demographic. And this was a explanatory sequential mixed methods design, which is getting a little bit into the weeds and the nerdy stuff of the research. But I first did quantitative with the flourishing scale, and then I did qualitative to kind of explore further the stories of those that were flourishing.
And that's fantastic, really, being mixed methods, because like you said, you can have a data-driven approach, albeit by a tool, but then also explore the qualitative aspects. So really dig into the stories, which again, I think are informative and powerful, actually. And so I guess there was a real shift away from the traditional deficit-based model of paramedic well-being. Could I get you to really unpack maybe why it was so important to study flourishing rather than burnout or stress or mental illness and maybe flip the narrative?
Yeah, absolutely. And this actually all started in 2016. I went to a SMAC conference in Dublin, and Adrian Plunkett was speaking on a formal feedback system called Learning from Excellence. And it was at a university hospital. I forget the name right now, but he was speaking about how we often focus a lot of our quality improvement or a lot of our quality assurance on the errors and the negatives. And that's, of course, important. We have to learn from our mistakes and prevent those errors in the future. But as he was emphasizing, that often kind of negates the 99% of the really excellent work that's being done, or the normal day-to-day work that's being done. And this just absolutely fascinated me. And then this kind of appreciative approach was really interesting to me. So I wanted to kind of look at what it is in paramedics that helps them flourish. Typically, paramedicine and the well-being side has been explored from a deficit base, like you mentioned. Who is and why are they getting occupational stress injuries? What's causing PTSD? What's causing burnout? And of course, those are important questions, incredibly important. But if they're the only question that we ask, we're completely ignoring the other side of the coin, right? And there are people that are in the job that are thriving. I can think of many role models that are, thriving on the front lines after 40 years. They make it to retirement. And when I asked some of the participants about their role models in the job, those people were often the people that came up. So it was really, really interesting to me to explore all kind of perspectives. Not to say that people are losing or winning if they're leaving the job or if they're developing occupational stress injuries, but I think it's just really important that we ask not just a pathogenic lens, that we're also using a salutogenic approach, so a strength-based design.
I think it's absolutely essential because, to your point, there'll be members of staff on most stations actually, where by their mechanisms of thinking and indeed maybe their problem solving and just their general approach to the job and indeed to life has kept them healthy and indeed kept them engaged for long periods of time. And it's really powerful and indeed insightful to look at just do a deep dive into that. But also to your point around, flourishing is more than just feeling good. It's about functioning well as well as feeling good. So it's not just feelings based, and it's maybe a toolkit approach, but there is certainly an element of, functional health, ergonomic health, physical health, mental health. It's to your point, it's nuanced and complex. It's not as linear as people might have it. But could I get you to just maybe parse apart for us that distinction, Paige, around what functioning well looks like in real world paramedicine, or indeed what was born in the literature?
Yeah, like why should we care about flourishing? It in studies it has shown that people that are flourishing in an organization are happier, they're more engaged, they have decreased intention to leave, there's decreased absenteeism, and absenteeism is expensive, but also presenteeism, where people are, they're showing up to work, but they're not engaged, they're not motivated, they're not learning, and they can kind of have a negative impact on others around them. So I think the biggest thing with flourishing is people they're feeling that meaning at work, and they're still finding opportunities. They're learning. They feel like they're challenged. They feel like the organization cares about their development. And flourishing is definitely not happening in a vacuum, right? Like someone's well-being outside of work is obviously going to have a huge impact on their well-being at work. For the scope of the project, I kind of had to focus just on a workplace flourishing. but I don't want to completely negate the impact, obviously, that your personal life is going to have on your well-being at work. But I think just to really emphasize a lot of the system things that came out of my research. So people are feeling like there's a sense of opportunity. They feel like they have an opportunity to learn, like the organization cares about their development. They have connection within and a sense of belonging. I think all those things are really important, not just, happy emotions or happy feeling all the time. Positive emotions do come into it, right? With, social well-being, psychological well-being, emotional well-being. And flourishing is not just happy emotions all the time. We don't want to not feel negative emotions. I think Andy Bell said, you'd be a potato in that case. And another podcast I listened to, she said, those are dead people feelings, right? The spectrum of life is a wild one. But flourishing is that you're still feeling good and you're still functioning well in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you're right. It's not the absence really of those feelings. It's more maybe transcending those. So it's acknowledging them for what they are, moving through them, and still functioning in a positive sense. But the research, which we'll put in the show notes actually, Paige, so people can go away and read it in slow time. You describe five key senses really associated with paramedic flourishing. Maybe could you walk us through really those senses and explain why they matter in an operational environment?
Absolutely. So the senses came from the type of qualitative kind of thematic analysis that I did. I ended up with aggregate dimensions that were common themes that kind of described how people moved with flourishing in the organization. And there was a lot about, mindset and culture. But I found that, and belonging, but I found that these things were all operating kind of at the same time. It wasn't just about someone's mindset. It wasn't just about opportunity or the culture of the workplace. They were kind of all like operating at the same time across different contexts. So that's where the senses came in. And that's how my brain kind of made sense of what I was seeing in the data. And the five senses were kind of a way to describe the common themes that were important to the paramedics that were flourishing. So this all stemmed from their stories. I'm not coming up with any of these ideas. They're very gracious with their stories, but the five senses were a sense of role identity congruence, a sense of coherence, a sense of opportunity, a sense of self, and a sense of connection. So from the top, a sense of role identity congruence. So all paramedics, many paramedics are going to have different role identities. So who I see myself as a paramedic and what's important to me. Dr. Moz and Dr. Donnelly and a team of researchers have focused on this. And paramedics can have kind of different role identities. So maybe they really identify as a clinician and clinical competence is really important to them. Maybe they're a thrill seeker. Maybe they're a community member. These things are all going to be impacted by, of course, their own previous experience, their personal values, their network, those around them. But what I found is that when there's congruence, so if who I think I am as a paramedic and the job that I'm doing day to day are aligned, that will help me flourish. As an example, if being a part of the community is really important to me, if it's maybe like a smaller community, I like to, I can see clients over and over again. I can get an update on how they're doing. Then maybe being a community paramedic is better aligned for me, where I can continuously see clients. I can see the difference that I'm making. And I feel like a part of the community and mattering in the community. So that might create congruence between who I think I am as a paramedic and the job that I'm doing day to day. Alternatively, if clinical competence is really important to me and clinical expertise, maybe I find a role where it's like a first response unit that's a, ACP or a critical care response unit. and I can jump on high acuity calls and really advance my skills and use my high acuity skills a lot more often, then I might have congruence between who I think I am as a paramedic and the job that I'm doing every day.
I think sometimes when you're embedded within a community, there is far much more alignment with the efforts and indeed the care afforded on a daily basis. You can just see the difference and you can build relationships. And I think the absence, something I struggled with really as a paramedic is obviously no 2 days are the same, but having that just having that presence in the community. I did some primary care work myself, and being embedded was you could build those relationships, and there was so I could very much identify with that through the literature and indeed through my own career.
And I think on the role identity piece, it's going to be different for everybody, right? So you need to kind of find what is the right niche for you. I had the opportunity to work in community paramedicine for a short time, but I just wanted to learn something new and try something new. And while I learned a lot and it was really, really meaningful, and I did feel more a part of the community, I kind of found that a lot of the joy from my job and the things that I really loved, I was missing there. So I explored other opportunities, and now I work as a special operations paramedic, and that gives me some more of the things that kind of give me life every day. And to my point, it's just going to be different for everyone, and you have to kind of know yourself and find out, who am I as a paramedic? And that's also going to be influenced by our education system, which kind of goes into the next one, which is a sense of coherence. And as we mentioned, flourishing is not just feeling positive emotions all the time. A sense of coherence is kind of understanding where you are in the broader context. So I understand I'm a tiny piece of this puzzle in the Ottawa Paramedic Service that's part of the City of Ottawa, that's part of the healthcare system in Ontario, that's part of the healthcare system in Canada. And it takes a lot to move that bigger system. But I have an understanding that I can kind of reconcile the ups and the downs because I know that it's all part of this bigger picture of life. So I know that I have the resources to manage it and the kind of ability to reconcile both those up and downs. And I think our education system for new paramedics can impact our ability to see the bigger system at large and the healthcare system, and to focus on system factors like that.
Absolutely, and I would agree with that. And actually, it's really interesting you say just trying different elements of paramedicine because I actually really fundamentally believe that. I think sometimes it takes a while maybe to find your niche or indeed to find what interests you and to really point the pace and cadence of work as well. The primary care has got a very different cadence and pace and acuity to critical care or indeed special operations, which is again a different subspecialism, but and almost sometimes it's a finding your niche, but also understanding, I think, and this is probably a podcast in itself of when maybe that niche it's time to move on and explore another facet of paramedicine, just to keep the curiosity, keep learning new skills and indeed new themes and also new ways of doing things. It's a very different world, the special operations world to the community paramedicine, and just to your point, actually, role identity congruence. I think from your research page really emerged as a major theme. Could I get you to speak to misalignment, really? Because I guess in a way, misalignment from that role identity in a system can impact well-being, and that was borne out in the research. Could I get you to sort of unpack and speak to that?
Yeah, I think Dr. Maz and Dr. Donnelly really touch on this and its impact on paramedic well-being and how that dissonance can create problems. And I think maybe our misalignment in our education system has contributed to that. Because if you in Canada, in Ontario, it's a 2-year program for entry to practice. And then in those 2 years, of course, you have to cover everything that's going to kill someone now. So there's very little time. And I think it is shifting towards more like holistic care and social needs and special populations and care of older adults. But if they're all graduating with an identity of we're resuscitationists all the time, that's going to create some dissonance when they actually go into the role, and that's not the job that we're doing. Even though the job is incredibly meaningful and purposeful, if someone believes that it's different, then that can create misalignment. The paramedics that were flourishing had kind of an acknowledgement of this, and then they understood that it was time to either make a choice or a change. Not everybody needs to stay in the job forever. That's not necessarily success for someone. But you kind of have to make a choice or a change if you recognize that you're experiencing dissonance here. Are there opportunities in the workplace where you can learn something new and feel more challenged or feel more aligned with your role identity? Or do you need to maybe realign your thinking with what our job actually is? And can we change our mindset in that way? I think this goes into one of the other senses, which would be sense of self, which is really knowing your own personal values and how they can impact the roles that you should be seeking in the job. Because it's going to be very difficult if you don't have a sense of self that's maybe differentiated from just your role as a paramedic. It's going to be really difficult to have positive well-being in the workplace if you don't have a sense of self outside of who you are as a paramedic, which was something that participants spoke about.
I'm going to progress slightly, Paige, because I think you've kind of answered quite a lot of my questions there, actually. But I would just say, and indeed, maybe we could point to organizational culture, and if I could get you really to unpack how, through the literature, really organizational culture features in your work, and indeed just how it enables paramedics to flourish through positive organizational culture. Could I get you to speak to the themes that really emerge there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was some really interesting discussions about organizational culture. When I asked participants what they felt of the culture in the workplace, some of them said they couldn't even describe it. They didn't even feel any particular type of culture. Other participants discussed the culture like a blanket, where new paramedics were maybe coming in really excited and really just motivated for the new role. And then the culture of the workplace was like a blanket that kind of stifled that. And that's when we talk about presenteeism, that can be that kind of culture that maybe the negativity is bringing people down with it. Negativity in the workplace, I think it's an important way that people connect. I think like the only thing for sure in this life is that we're all going to experience pain and hardship, and that's often the only way that people know how to connect. But those that were flourishing kind of spoke about an acknowledgement of this type of organizational culture, and then had an ownership of how they were contributing to it in different ways, and were taking kind of a more like individualized stance on it. I think the most dangerous culture that would be kind of detrimental to flourishing in these kind of organizations would be a depersonalization of people. So I think what people really desire is to feel like the organization cares about them, that they are valued, that their unique goals and skills can be utilized in the organization. And this really speaks to a sense of opportunity as well that I found. A lot of the participants spoke about finding opportunity and that sense of opportunity in the teams that they were a part of, whether that's special operations or groups or committees or different opportunities within the organization. They had chances to learn, they had chances to grow. They felt like the organization cared about their professional and their personal development. One participant spoke about traditional kind of engagement practices often focus on like social activities and pizza parties and those kind of things. And he said people need something more tangible than that. They need a goal, which I think is just the perfect descriptor of this study.
Yeah, indeed, indeed, and to your point, you touched on it earlier, really around the sense of autonomy and having a sense of autonomy and say and value within an organization, so that you feel like there's influence and you can almost influence the trajectory of your reality and indeed of care, and that people and leadership are listening, which I think is important. Having visited quite a few EMS agencies in various roles myself, I think the ones which have a really poor organizational culture, the ones which are just time-based and people feel like they're almost hit over the head or indeed punished and constantly watched for every second, and there is almost there's no room to breathe or indeed no room to indeed engage, because it's all just time based. And time is important, but it is one facet of pre-hospital care. It doesn't necessarily give you the affordance of care unseen, or indeed the affordance of compliance to protocol, but also creativity and new ways of working and that sense of autonomy. So there really is, like you said, more to flourishing than what meets the eye. And organizational culture really, I can see absolutely influences that. Just pivoting and slightly look at it slightly for a moment and looking at the COVID-19 pandemic, actually, and you spoke to earlier, Paige, you were saying, this research was conducted in the COVID pandemic, and what a time to really look at paramedic flourishing in such a visceral and challenging time, really. Could I get you to really just unpack the responses you were getting in that time and examples of growth, meaning, and/or connection in such a period of adversity, really?
Mhm. Yeah, it was, I had some really interesting and very varied responses and their experiences of the pandemic. For one thing, our system is mobile deployment. So we would have some time at start of shift where we all start in the same location. There's like a batch meeting where we can speak with our supervisor and the rest of our platoon start. And then it's you and your partner against the world. And in the pandemic, that was canceled, the start of shift kind of meetings. There was very, very little social interaction. So people relied really heavily on their partner. And those connections were incredibly important for people. So to have the autonomy to choose their permanent partner was huge, because that had such an impact. It was like they said, it was me and my partner against the world. We would go out there and it's just the two of you every day for 12 hours. Alternatively, people felt a real sense of duty to the community, and they felt like they were part of something bigger. This global pandemic where frontline healthcare workers making a difference. And it was really scary at the start. I remember just the fear of the unknown. We didn't know how this was going to impact the community. We didn't know if we had the proper PPE, if we were doing things correctly. So there was a lot of unknown during the pandemic, but still there was a sense of that desire to be there for the community and that kind of duty as being involved in something bigger. And there was also the opportunity to be part of vaccination teams. I'm not sure if your system had this, but Canadian paramedics were involved in the delivery of thousands and thousands of vaccines in the community to those that were most vulnerable. So we would hop in a bus and be charted down to a retirement home or a long-term care home and deliver hundreds of vaccines a day to the most vulnerable population. And that would be met with staff like clapping on the arrival. And that was so meaningful for paramedics to be able to do. I remember I did one of these days and I got to give a resident her first COVID vaccine while she was on Zoom with her family. And it was like so meaningful for the family just to have a sense of hope that, we might be able to see our loved one again. We can maybe see a brighter future. So that sense of meaning and mattering in the community was really important for people.
So just pivoting slightly and looking at one of the themes in the research page is really the sense of coherence and alignment, really just looking at paramedics making sense of chaos, trauma, and indeed uncertainty, and really just that long-term well-being. But when they're aligned and they've kind of got a coherent reason for being at work, it offsets or mitigates some of that chaos and indeed some of that trauma. Could I get you to really unpack and speak to that?
A sense of coherence can kind of be boiled down to our system thinking and ability to see the bigger picture. So some of the flourishing participants had worked in other paramedic systems, which provided them some perspective into, we're not only facing these challenges here, it's very easy to get wrapped up in our own little bubble, but there's still offload delays in other countries. And speaking with paramedics around the world is really humbling to know that a lot of us are struggling with the same things. And it's not unique to our role at the Ottawa Paramedic Service. So having that perspective, having the belief that you have the resources to manage it. So that is going to be impacted by your well-being outside of work, right? If you haven't met your lowest hierarchy of needs, you're not going to be able to think about what opportunity I should be seeking at work. So those are, of course, important. And then the meaningful side of it. So just knowing that, yes, there's good and there's bad, and our job can be very traumatic, but it can also be very rewarding. And it is a privilege to be the ones that, have a role to do, but have a skill set that allows us to be helpers in really, really difficult situations. A colleague of mine, often after, a big call or a really traumatic call, will be asked by a supervisor, "Are you guys okay? Do you want to maybe talk to peer support, or do you guys need a minute after that?" And a colleague of mine would say, "I'm better. I'm Believe it or not, like I'm better after that call." And that's not to say that, it's not traumatic or that it's not difficult, but to be able to use your skill set in environments that call for it was really meaningful to them. And that should be kind of celebrated, that role identity was able to be helpful to him in kind of reconciling both the trauma of the call, but also the ability to use his skill set and to be helpful in that situation.
And that kind of leads me nicely actually onto the next question, which is around belonging and connection. And it is a theme that comes out in the research page around that sense of connection and also that sense of community. So, your relationship with colleagues, with teams, and the wider organization. And just feeling appreciated, feeling affirmed, feeling like you belong. Could I get you to really unpack that?
Yeah, sense of connection was huge for flourishing paramedics. Um, when I did the quantitative analysis, there were two things that were significantly, like statistically significantly associated with flourishing. And those were involvement with specialty teams and involvement with groups and committees in the service. So at the Ottawa Paramedic Service, we have 4 specialty teams. So there's a tactical unit, a public order unit, a bike team, and a marine unit. And then the groups and committees are, some of them are spearheaded by my colleagues, like an environment committee, a scheduling working group, there's a test team, there's a peer support group, health and safety. And being part of those groups and committees or being part of specialty teams was actually predictive of flourishing. So if someone was involved, they were 3 times more likely to be flourishing in the workplace. There were no other factors of identity, age, years of service, gender, nothing else was predictive of flourishing. And a lot of it came down to the sense of connection that they were having within these teams. So, it doesn't necessarily need to be like a 25-person tactical team if that's not what your community needs. But even an environment committee, being a part of something where they felt like they had a voice and a choice and connection within the organization was huge for people. If we think of what bonds these specialty teams, it's often not the like social interactions outside of work, but it's the opportunity to train together, to go through hardship together. That's really bonding, and that camaraderie to know that if I go into work with someone else from my team, I know that we're both pulling in the same direction. I know that we've trained together. I trust this person. And that was huge for people.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more, actually. But just looking at your research really from a leadership lens, actually, you said this before, Paige, in the interview, and I absolutely agree with it, which is that actually staff retention and lo losing staff is organizationally expensive, because there is so much resources poured into that person, and also we all lose out as a community from that person's knowledge and understanding that they had within the organization. Could I get you to really speak to, from a leadership perspective, what managers and senior clinicians could take away from this research if they want to maybe improve retention or indeed engagement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the two biggest things I would say is that we need to start asking questions about from a strength-based lens. So what is going well, and what's the ideal picture of the future, to form kind of our goals and priorities. And then two, I think that these system factors are so much more important for paramedic well-being compared to the individual factors. And I think that's really empowering for an organization and for a leader to hear, because if this was all finished and all I said was, it's just about the person's mindset, that's going to be really hard for anyone to change, right? We can't change people's behavior. We can't change the culture by saying we're going to have a better culture. So I think speaking to leaders, the system factors have such a huge impact. And a lot of my suggestions, leaders might say, well, those are kind of process driven. But those process changes are how we change and contribute to paramedic well-being. So we can't change the culture by saying, we're changing the culture here, we're going to have a better culture. We have to change what we're doing, or we have to do things differently or do different things. We can't just change it based on feelings. So I think that's huge when it comes to this research, is that there's a lot of system things that impacted paramedic flourishing. When I think of how and the burden on organizations to change these things, it can sound expensive and very resource heavy to say you need to have opportunities and special operations opportunities. But I would challenge anyone within an organization to think of what is unique to their community and what their community needs. So maybe you don't need a 25-person tactical team because your community is not doing a lot of high risk warrants. But maybe you're around a lot of water. Maybe you would benefit from a marine team. Maybe you lack primary care access in your community, and community paramedicine is much more important. Maybe there's a lot of older adults, and a frailty team might be better. So I think there are going to be unique needs in every community, and that's kind of what you need to parse out. And then I would say, like I already said, it is very expensive to have a retention problem. And for retention, we know that we need to focus on opportunity. So the Paramedic Association of Canada published a paramedic career framework, which has different opportunities in different kind of pathways, like a researcher, a clinician, an organizational leader. And it's all about having like a portfolio career. So you want to have access to opportunities in different pathways, and to be able to see where they are in an organization. So if a leader is looking at a sense of opportunity, and they want to look at like what would be good to implement, what would be better and then what would be best. For a sense of opportunity, I would say, do you have any opportunities? Is there even a group or a committee? Like that's lower hanging fruit than a specialty team, right? Could we signpost these opportunities better? Could we make it an expression of interest? Could we train them once they have access to these groups or committees or teams? And then, so that might be good, is having any sort of opportunities within the organization. Better might be clear succession planning so that people know what they need to do to access different opportunities. And then best might be mapping it to this sort of career framework that signposts, these are opportunities in this pathway. This is what you need to do to get there. Because if in our system, like if someone wants to be a police sergeant, they know what books to read, they know what policies to study. But if you want to be a leader in paramedicine, it's a little bit more confusing.
Yeah, listen, I fundamentally agree with that. And I think, as to our earlier point, it comes back to that sense of agency and indeed that sense of autonomy where you can, to your point, see clearly the path ahead. And there is a career framework and there's an ability to influence the trajectory of your career so that people don't feel like they're continually maybe stuck sometimes. They feel like there's agency to move and to progress on. And to your point, there's clear gateways and or markers, education or otherwise, that they can progress through to get where they need to be. And giving the front line that sense of agency probably gives them a plan, a clear roadmap as to how to progress. And without that, like you said, there's maybe disenfranchisement and indeed a real lack of motivation. Paige, a few more questions before we come into land. And this question is almost the million-dollar question, really, but it really aligns with your research, and one of the things I love about your research, and we'll put it in the show notes for people to go away and read, is that it really does, it flips the narrative. It looks at the positive aspects of why paramedics are flourishing at work. And to your point, instead of just maybe focusing on the burnout or the PTSD, it looks at some of these fundamental tenets. But could I get you to speak to really, if a paramedic service it was to really move from a reactive mental health model to a proactive strength-based model without really minimizing real psychological risk. Could I get you to speak to how they could maybe flip that narrative from a reactive to a proactive model?
Mhm. Yeah, that is a million-dollar question, right? And I think it does come down to a lot of the processes within the organization and how that is making people feel. Does that give them a sense of opportunity? Does that give them a sense of connection? Does it give them a sense of coherence? When you release um, an email with a new policy, does it clearly describe why that policy is enacted, and can people get behind those reasons? I think how an organization communicates uh, with staff is really important, and not just in the words or the way, but if someone on the front line has an idea and they bring that forward and they get radio silence on the other end, that's going to negatively impact their perception of many things within the organization, right? It's going to impact they're not going to feel heard. They're not going to feel like valued in the organization. So I think all of these things, and then focusing on the process related to a sense of opportunity, sense of coherence, sense of connection. And for opportunity, I think there are probably already positions within your organization that could be better signposted as opportunities that people can get excited about. When I first became a paramedic in Ottawa, we had a paramedic response unit where it's a first response car. And initially, no one wanted to be on that. It was like the bottom of our higher group was forced into it. And every year that would happen until a couple years ago, they revamped the program, and it became one of the most sought after teams within the organization. And this didn't require a bunch of money or a bunch of change. They made it an expression of interest. They gave them extra training opportunities. And then this team is now valued as like expert clinicians within the organization. And that has flipped the script on people's kind of opinion towards being part of that team. So I think, I mean, there are many, many suggestions that I have. I'd be happy to chat with any paramedic leaders, policymakers, educators on like specific things. But I think a lot of it is process. And you have to look at how you're doing things within the organization. Using appreciative inquiry can be helpful. So appreciative inquiry kind of focuses on like, what is the ideal picture of the future? So there's 5 Ds associated with it. I like to say not the 5 Ds of dodgeball, but 5 Ds of appreciative inquiry. And the most important is dream. So discovery and dream. So we can think of discovery, like what has worked well in the past for us here and why did that work so well? And then dream would be thinking no red tape, like pie in the sky. We're not thinking about budgets. We're thinking about what is the ideal picture of the future and how can we kind of replicate that picture of hope, the best ideal outcome for this situation. Apple used to do that when they'd, have a meeting and say, what if we couldn't sell phones anymore? What if we couldn't sell computers? What would we do? So we have to be thinking like creatively and optimistically about the future. And then, like I said, many, many other more specific ideas about building connection and building teams and trying to replicate that special operations feeling in our own core operations, as we like to say. But I think a lot of it is process driven, and the organization can make a huge impact.
Yeah, indeed. And I really like something you just said there, Paige, around just being transparent around the why. So if there is a protocol change or indeed a standard operating procedure change or a guideline change that's been flagged up, has been a near miss or maybe a root cause analysis from a critical error, but the service will be transparent about that. And actually the to your point, the more you can be transparent and engage with frontline and sit and get people to see the why will really motivate people to enact that change so that they won't make the same mistake. But when it's very linear and it's maybe the reasons why aren't given, it doesn't necessarily embody as much compliance, or indeed you don't bring people along on that journey. And I think that's really vital, the bringing people along on the why of the journey.
One,
Yeah.
one more thing on that point. I think when an error happens or a near miss happens, where we are really good at exploring like what led to this, and what were the small factors that the human factors or the technical factors that led to this. Whereas when something goes really well, a crew does really well on a call, you might hear like great job, or a supervisor might tell you, great job on that, or colleagues might say, oh yeah, like Owen and his partner, they're always great. They always do such a good job. But that's usually where it ends. And we don't usually explore like, why did they do so well? How did they do so well? Did they share? Do these partners work together all the time for years? Do they share their mental model approaching on their way to the call? Did they write some stuff down? Did they do the math ahead of time? Did they listen to a podcast about TXA or, head injuries, and what led to them doing so well, and what was so different about what they did compared to the rest of the, everyday work that's happening. So I think we could do a better job exploring how and why things are going well when they do.
Paige, as we finish off, just one last question, and it's a question which sometimes I don't like to ask, but because there is no one thing that you could change to promote flourishing. It's multifaceted, as your research points to. But from your themes that you explored and we've unpacked, Is there anything that you see, maybe, or indeed from your experience from looking at other ambulance services, just one facet really that could promote flourishing and maybe have the greatest impact on culture or organizations, just something which you've seen through either born through literature or through your experience?
Tough question. I might sound like a broken record, but I think really shifting the focus from individual factors to the system. When I make recommendations, I often do the individual things last, because I think the majority of the time we put a lot of the focus and the onus on individual employees to do this seminar on mental well-being, to do more yoga, to eat better, to exercise more, to know where you are on this scale, and speak up and ask for help when you need it, when you're here in the red. But I think that the system factors actually have such a big impact on paramedic well-being that we need to shift the focus from the individual to the system and understand how the system is contributing to individual well-being. One other thing is nature versus nurture comes up a lot when I talk about this, because people ask, well, is it just, people that would be flourishing are applying for these teams, or they're seeking out these opportunities, or they're involved in these groups and committees, and they would be involved anyway, and then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They create the culture within that subgroup. But I would take much more of a kind of a growth mindset on our career trajectory and our personality, right? I don't think anyone's personality or career is defined in stone, and I think it's impacted a lot by our relationships and our networks and the people that we surround ourselves with. So I think that if we put more emphasis on nurture and nurturing and succession planning, I think would have huge benefits, because I can think of a time where someone told me that I should apply to special operations. And even though it was an incredibly short conversation, I might not have seen myself in that role before that. And to have that coaching and mentoring is huge for people.
Yes, and I think that's powerful, and I agree with that. And I think sometimes that positive affirmation, but also the processes and shifting focus onto an enabling culture of process driven, where people can absolutely see a career pathway forward, and you can have exposure to mentors and indeed to not to a linear path, but there's many deviations. But to your point as well, there are educational enabled pathways, so that actually they can be they can absolutely be achieved, and there's a sense of autonomy and achievement in that. Paige, listen, it's been fascinating just to both read your research and indeed chat to you for the past hour. We'll put your research in the show notes because I think it is a fascinating read, and I just want to say thank you for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm just so grateful to all the participants that shared their stories and everyone that's been so engaged with this research in such a positive way. So thank you.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.